We talked about it earlier in the show. Could President Donald Trump actually serve a third term in the nation's highest office? James Ramoser, who's the legal editor at Politico and a friend of the show, says yes. And he's even written about it in detail. James joins me now to explain how this could happen. James, thank you for being here. Let's first talk about this loophole that exists in the 22nd Amendment.
Right. So, Katie, I mean, many of your viewers probably know that there's a two-term limit on the presidency in the Constitution. It's in the 22nd Amendment. And what it says is that no president can be elected more than twice to the presidency. And crucially, I want to point out, for Trump's purposes, the amendment applies even to presidents who serve two non-consecutive terms like Trump has. So the amendment does seem to apply to Trump, and he shouldn't be able to run again in 2028, even if he wanted to. But critically, there's this little noticed loophole in the way that the 22nd Amendment is written, because the amendment says no president shall be elected to the presidency more than twice. But there are other ways to become president other than being elected president. One such way is you can be the vice president, and the president can step down or resign or be impeached, and you could ascend to the presidency that way. And technically, you weren't elected president in that case. And so one of the things that I explored in the piece that I wrote for Politico is whether Trump could somehow try to exploit that loophole to become president again in 2028. Even though he wouldn't be allowed to run again himself, he could find someone else to run at the top of the ticket. He could be the vice presidential candidate, and there would be an explicit promise, if they won, that the person at the top of the ticket, call him J.D. Vance, say, could resign on day one, allow Trump to ascend back to the presidency. And that does not seem to violate the technical language of the 22nd Amendment. And of course, the Supreme Court, as you know, is very textualist, very technical, and might even uphold such a gambit.
The idea is that if he exploited this loophole, he could actually tell the American public, this is what we're doing. It's not trying to hide the ball in any way. He could run for office, say, I am eventually going to be president again, but you have to elect someone else, and then that individual has to appoint me. That's one.
He could do it out in the open, right? And we should say there's been no explicit, plans to actually do this. Like, he hasn't specifically said he intends to do this. So this is kind of a hypothetical. But I don't want to come across as being alarmist or, too speculative about this, because what Trump has said repeatedly, both in the last few weeks and for years, actually, is he has mused about the possibility of being president beyond the two-term limit, being president for a third term or even a fourth term. And I think his supporters would say that he's been joking in all those remarks, but I think that it's not too early to start taking some of those jokes seriously, at least contemplating whether he really does mean that. It's certainly something that at least is on his mind.
All right, putting aside the loophole, you talk about three other ways that it would be possible. Those are perhaps a little bit more far-reaching, but you still make a plausible argument. What are they?
Well, I mean, I think that the scariest hypotheticals are if Trump just decides to defy the 22nd Amendment altogether, not even bother to try to use the loophole in the language, but let's just say he decides he's just going to run again anyway. And in 2028, let's say he still has the strong support of the Republican Party, and he just decides, I'm going to run for president, I'm going to declare myself a president for a third term, regardless of what the 22nd Amendment says, and see if someone stops him. And who would stop him is the big question that I looked at in this piece. It would, of course, be litigated. It would go up to the Supreme Court very quickly, and maybe the Supreme Court would try to stop him. But it's no sure thing, I think. If you have the chosen nominee of the Republican Party holding himself out as a candidate in a polarized election year, declaring himself the president, half of the country wants him to run again, it would take quite a lot of courage for the Supreme Court to kick him off the ballot, which they refused to do last year, by the way, on a different constitutional issue involving the 14th Amendment's insurrection clause. And of course, it's a very conservative Supreme Court and, has three of Trump's nominees currently. It might have more Trump nominees by the time we get to 2028. And so, again, I think that's a scenario at least worth thinking about.
You also suggest it's possible to either appeal the 22nd Amendment or a fourth option.
Yeah, of course, Trump could, actually generate a movement to formally repeal the 22nd Amendment and, take that provision out of the Constitution. That would require supermajorities of Congress and the states that I think are pretty implausible in the polarized nation. But then the fourth and I think the most frightening option altogether is if Trump just decides he's not going to leave, whether he runs again or not. He just decides he wants to be president beyond 2028. Again, this is really verging into totally speculative territory. I don't want to come across as an alarmist. But I think it's important to remember Trump does have a track record of attempting to hold on to power when it did not belong to him. He did that in 2020 after he lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden, and he did everything in his power to try to remain in office despite the fact that he had no entitlement to do so. Now, at that point, our institutions held, and they prevented Trump from doing that. But what my piece explores is the thinking by some constitutional scholars that is no guarantee that the institutions of democracy would hold again if Trump tried something similar 4 years from now.
Well, as you point out, he may not even have to do that because there may be a constitutional way he could get it back altogether. James, thank you for joining us, as always.